Today I'm announcing the beginning of public consultation about the Illawarra's offshore wind zone.
Giant wind farms built in the ocean near the coast, sending locals into a spin.
The Prime Minister has demanded Barnaby Joyce be sacked from the Shadow Ministry over a comment he made at a rally against wind farms.
But your greatest power is organising on a national level. And your greatest weapon is to turn up in numbers in Canberra, in Macquarie Street, in George Street, in Queen Street. And the bullet you have is that little piece of paper. And it goes in a magazine called The Voting Box. And it's coming up. Get ready to load that magazine. Go, goodbye, Chris. Goodbye, Stephen. Goodbye, Albo.
The Illawarra, home to the beautiful Mount Kira, the marvellous Kiama Blowhole, and of course, the Port Kembla Steelworks. With a population of around 250,000, energy is a key part of what keeps this city alive.
We are all well aware that our environment is changing rapidly. We are noticing effects globally as well as in our own environment. Growing up in Australia, we have been gifted with the privilege of experiencing the beauty of Mother Nature, her winds, oceans, teaching us all the patterns of life. The generosity of the environment is something we all take for advantage and often forget how much we consume. Our high-paced consumerist society has driven our motives to go beyond what is needed and continue to crave more. It's time to now reflect, not only on how much she gives us, but how we can all make a difference in giving back. We watch as our lush trees turn to steel traffic lights, and the ants that once carved through the soil replaced by noisy cars weaving in and out of their lines. The emissions that inevitably continue to pollute our earth is a change that we have to learn how to manage. I'm Millie.
And I'm Sam.
And today we'll be exploring the interesting world of wind turbines in the Illawarra. Okay, so what is the documentary about? In June of 2024, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy declared the Illawarra coastal area the site of a 1,000 square kilometre wind farm. This declaration site was not favoured by many of the residents of the Illawarra region, and as a result caused a lot of contention around what is happening and why. We've decided to make this documentary to share the factual information we find and allow you to make up your own opinion based on the facts. Although not fully approved by the government yet, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water received over 14,000 submissions from the public about the proposed instalment between August to November 2023. 70% of which had concerns for marine life.
What were some of the main concerns in the submissions? The community raised concerns of environmental impacts, particularly on whales and birds, visual amenity, the safe management of shipping to and from Port of Kembla, impacts on commercial and recreational fishing, and recycling of blades and turbine materials. The submissions also had an overwhelming amount of support for the local source of clean renewable energy, action to address climate change, employment opportunities, and potential benefits to local community and First Nations peoples.
There is no doubt that we are under a time limit. With the coal power stations shutting down in the next 10 years, we all need to join forces and start acting now for the benefit of our future environment.
Before we start, we have to answer 3 questions. Number 1, what is a wind turbine? Number 2, how much energy does a wind turbine actually produce? And number 3, why is an offshore wind farm the most effective renewable method? To answer our first question, we contacted Ty Christopher, a UOW researcher who has been involved in the wind farms since the beginning.
What is a wind farm? A wind farm is it's called a turbine. It's basically something that captures the energy of the wind, usually through spinning blades. That's the most common technology. And it converts the mechanical energy of the wind into electricity.
Yeah.
effectively turning a generator, and then cables from that go and connect the wind farm into the electricity grid. The wind farm can be located anywhere that captures a good wind resource. That can be on land or it can be out to sea.
Question number 2. How much energy does a wind turbine actually produce? An average onshore wind turbine can produce more than 6 million kilowatts an hour every year. The DCCEEW says that the proposed Illawarra offshore wind farms have the potential to generate up to 2.9 gigawatts of renewable energy, which is enough power to generate 1.8 million homes. And question number 3. Why is an offshore wind farm the most effective renewable method? Offshore winds are found to produce more than double the energy that of an onshore wind farm. Wind out in the ocean is steadier and more reliable, as there are no hills or man-made structures to interrupt the flow. Wind farms produce the least amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and 84% of Australians rank wind power as their top 3 preferred sources, meeting Australia's energy future needs. Our first interview was with Michelle Voyer. Michelle is a UOW researcher who joined forces in early 2023 with Member of Cunningham Alison Burns to better understand what impacts offshore wind can have in our area. Michelle believes that offshore wind should definitely be considered and be a part of the mix for our goal of net zero.
Yeah, I think it's a major change that we've got coming to our local environment, and we need to move towards new forms of energy, and so it's really important for the community to get involved in that decision making about what our future looks like. It definitely needs to be part of the mix. I think consideration of it, we need to give it consideration, because one of the benefits of offshore wind is that it provides large gigawatt scale power close to where we need it, which we can't get from many other sources to the extent that we can from offshore wind. So even onshore wind and solar don't give us quite the scale that we need for the really big, hard to abate sectors like our steel manufacturing, for example. It's going to need a lot more power. So when it all started to become apparent that our local region was going to be, was identified as an offshore wind zone, we at the University of Wollongong put our heads together and thought, well, we have a role to play in this, and part of our role is just making sure that the information that's out there in the public is scientific, it's something that people can trust. I think we need to recognise that offshore wind is one part of a whole broader transition. So we're not sitting back and waiting for offshore wind before we transition to new energy sources. But where offshore wind can add value is when we've done all the rooftop solar, when we've done as much as we can on land. This is the value add and the thing that will get us over the line in that last little bit. But we're a fair way behind other countries in terms of our development of offshore wind, so we get the benefits of learning from other countries and how they've been doing it. So I think it's just now a process of that local scale. What do we need to do differently here in our region in Australia? And that work needs to really start now.
Yeah. We wanted to ask Michelle the main concerns and what were the potential impacts on marine life.
There's a few key ones that have come up a lot in the public. I think number one is whales. Everyone loves whales. I love whales. They're the most beautiful creatures, and we live in an amazing place where we get to watch the whales go up and back every year. So we're all very attached to them, and so I don't think anyone wants to see that poorly impacted. So there's a lot of work to do to understand if they'll be impacted and how they'll be impacted. So the first question that needs to be answered is it actually going to affect their migration? Is the proposed zone in their migration path? That seems like a pretty simple question, but we actually don't know the answer yet. So that's the first question. And then once we understand that, we also need to understand how they'll interact with the infrastructure. And so there's a lot of unanswered questions around that too that need to be really looked into, and that can include things like where you position them, what kinds of anchors you use, what kind of chains you use, all kinds of different ways that can be used to address some of those potential impacts. So that work needs to start now. These are probably 10 years away from being actually in the water, but we need to be designing infrastructure like that now with circular economy principles in mind to make sure that as much as possible can be recycled or reused, and we minimise any waste. Yes, there will be environmental impacts, and we need to do a lot more research to understand exactly what they will be and what scale they'll be. But there's also a range of ways in which we can mitigate and address those impacts. So, drawing on studies from overseas, we can see that there's ways that we can address some of the key concerns through careful design, good science, and rigorous kind of monitoring and assessment over time. Yeah.
Michelle helped us better understand that there is not really enough information out there to determine whether particular factors would affect either marine life or human life.
But why is there so much controversy behind these wind turbines? We contacted Alex O'Brien and Amanda Delore, founding members of the Coalition Against Offshore Wind.
Well, firstly, there's nothing that's been done on this scale in a whale migration corridor. We've also got research from the University of Wollongong that shows there's a large rocky reef, out on the coastline, which fishermen have been talking about quite extensively for years. We've also got, when we look at some of the submissions from the environmental groups, again they talk about the unprecedented nature, the risk of entanglement to whales. We've seen with Blue Float's submission that there's 100 threatened endangered species in this zone. That's those that are threatened. What about all the other marine life, bird life? So there are some real concerns about the impact this project is going to have. And we know as well the real reason, or one of the main drivers, is for the production of green hydrogen and green ammonia, which will need a renewable energy source. We know it's in its infancy, it hasn't been done at scale, but the risk of a green ammonia leak, which has happened, and it's actually toxic, can sterilise cubic miles of ocean.
Here, Alex highlighted that there may be issues of a green ammonia leak. According to Iberdrola, green ammonia, also known as renewable ammonia, is a form of ammonia that is produced using renewable energy sources, and which is proposed as a sustainable, emission-free alternative with a multitude of applications in industry and other sectors. In the past, green ammonia has been found to be more harmful to marine life than oil.
We've seen in places like Portugal where the fishermen are now fighting against any more development off the coast because the 3 turbines that Blue Float CEO Carlos Martin Raval's established has seen the fish disappear around the turbines. We know that they went and saw a fixed bottom wind farm, but one that was on a seabed that had already been mined and dredged, so nowhere near a pristine environment.
And what do you think the solution to that is?
Well, it's definitely not floating offshore wind. So, and again, look, everything's got to be on the table when we're looking at the right energy mix. Really needs that independent panel to come together and have a look at what's right for every area. But we've also, as a society, got to have a look at our overall energy consumption. If we're really concerned about the climate, we need to be using more public transport. We need to rethink the way that we build it, with the suburban sprawl, and maybe look at higher density, type of living, like many countries in, Europe consider. Because, if we continue to clear more land, we reduce, trees, which are obviously capturing carbon, and we can't just keep building these big mansions as well, which consume huge amounts of electricity. Your latest iPhone consumes a huge amount of electricity as well. So as a society, we need to rethink the way we look at consumption.
Another concern that arose was not only the duration of the wind farms along the coast, but what will be done with the materials once they need replacing. We put up a panel on our Instagram page to allow members of the community to ask any inquiries that they wanted answered.
The first offshore wind farms that were ever installed across the globe were installed in the very early 1990s, around 1991 to 1993. Now those wind turbines are only now just reaching the end of their practical service life. So that gives us the greatest piece of evidence that the service life of this infrastructure in a very hostile environment out to sea is around 25 to 30 years based on how well it's maintained. Now the thing we need to remember is the bulk of the materials that go into offshore wind technology are steel and are copper. And there are completely mature recycling industries for those materials right now, even as we speak. So right now here today, something between 85 and 90% of the materials associated with offshore wind infrastructure are recyclable. The one part of the materials that is now emerging for recycling and as a commercialised recycling industry are the actual blades themselves, which are largely made from a composite material. There's been recent research that's reaching commercialisation level over in Europe at the moment that's showing ways to break down and reuse the materials in turbine blades, whether they're from offshore wind or whether they're from onshore wind turbines, which by the time we're talking 25 to 30 years in the future here in Australia, which is the time frame when any wind farms in Australia will be reaching their end of life, are highly likely to be completely mature recycling technology, which will mean they'll be 100% recyclable. One of the things we need to remember is that offshore wind turbines, because of their location, can be physically much larger than onshore wind turbines, and they also have a much higher capacity factor. That is, they put out a lot more electricity because of the better wind resource that they have access to by being offshore. So that means the amount of energy that they generate is maximised. That gives you much greater revenue from the assets because you're selling that energy into the grid. And what that means is the extra costs of them being located out to sea, to maintain them, to be sending people out there to maintain them, are more than offset. From the base level numbers that I've seen on the viability of offshore wind industry, it is highly commercially viable here in Australia due to the excellent wind resources that we have access to. Any infrastructure that's located a good distance out to sea is going to be subject to some very harsh environmental conditions. You've got the corrosiveness of salt water, waves, wind and the like. So it's absolutely true that offshore wind turbines and offshore wind technology is going to be much more expensive to maintain than onshore wind technology. You've also got the costs and the sheer logistics of getting people out there via boats and back again. But that extra expense is offset by the significant amount more energy that you can generate by locating wind turbines out to sea. One of the things we have in the electricity industry is called a capacity factor. It's a measure of how much a generator is available and how much of its capacity it can put out most of the time. On land, wind-based electricity generation has a capacity factor of around 30%, whereas out to sea, it's 50% or more. So the costs of maintaining infrastructure out to sea are offset by the fact that you get a lot more energy out of it by locating it there. Floating offshore wind technology, and that's what we need to employ here on the east coast of Australia because the continental shelf is relatively close to the coastline. So the water gets very deep very quickly as you go out to sea. So the technology involves a floating base that can, as its name implies, float up and down with the waves, and that is tethered down to the ocean floor, usually by 3 cables and 3 anchors that go into the ocean floor. The latest technology for those seabed anchors are screw-type anchors that go into the seabed or just basic mass foundations. The thinking being that we're looking to minimise the impact on the seabed from that anchor technology. It's also important in the Illawarra to remember that that same seabed has been scraped back and forth by fishing nets for the last 100 to 150 years through commercial fishing. So the impact of the offshore wind turbines, given that they will mean that that area itself can no longer be scraped with fishing nets, I think the ecological impact will probably work out to be to a net positive below the waterline. The biggest danger that we face in the energy transformation at the moment is delay. We do not have time to play around. We need to crack on with it. That's because we spent as a nation over 10 years doing little to nothing in terms of decarbonising our energy sources. It's hard to answer your question without making a political observation, but that is a fact. We had zero progress under the Morrison government on climate change and in particular on decarbonising the energy industry. What that means is we now have less time to get the job done before 2030 and out to 2050. That means we need to hit the accelerator on multiple fronts all at once. Yes, we need solar, we need home solar, we need large-scale solar farms, we need far more storage in the grid so that all of the abundant energy that happens when the sun shines and when the wind blows can actually be stored up and used when the sun's not shining or when the wind isn't blowing quite as strong. We need all of those things to happen, and we need them to happen within the next 10 years. The important thing to remember is the coal-fired power stations that are the backbone of the Australian energy grid are all at or reaching end of life. Nearly all of them will be gone due to age, due to old age, within 10 years. And all of them will be gone around 15 years from now. We need something to replace that so that we still have electricity, and renewables are our best bet here and now. The bottom line of it all is we don't know all the answers now. And so that's why what we're recommending at the University of Wollongong is rigorous academic study and research into the environmental impacts of offshore wind. There are three main reasons why offshore wind electricity generation plays a key role in our clean energy future and in our decarbonising future. The first one is size and scale. By that I mean solar panels on homes are fantastic. Australia's leading the world in taking up solar for our homes. But all of those are very small generators. They generate relatively small amounts of electricity, and the wires that they're connected to in the grid are the smallest capacity wires. We also need large-scale generation, and in particular we need it to decarbonise our heavy industries such as the steelworks here in Wollongong, as well as our large city centres, the Wollongong CBD, the Sydney CBD, and so forth. So that's the first reason that we need offshore wind as part of the energy mix, scale. The second one is capacity factor. That's the availability of generation expressed as the capacity of its total output over time. The capacity factor of solar is very low. The sun only shines usably for about a quarter of the day. So that's 25%. The capacity factor of onshore wind is 30%, and of offshore wind it's 50% or more. So that means the energy will be available more often when we need to use it. And then the third reason, the third benefit of offshore wind is proximity. Whilst we all like to think of ourselves as Australians as rough, tough bushies and that sort of thing, we're all a bunch of thin-blooded coasties by and large, and we live in a thin strip where the climate's better all the way along the east coast of Australia. And that means if we were to have, for instance, tons and tons of wind generation happening inland in Australia, then we need thousands of kilometres of overhead transmission lines to bring that energy from where it's generated out to the coast, to our cities, to our heavy industry. Whereas locating offshore wind generation 20 kilometres out to sea means we only have to transport all of that renewable energy 20 kilometres before we can actually use it. Yeah. So the three reasons are scale, availability, and proximity to where we're going to use it. The Illawarra is therefore a perfect fit for offshore wind. The way I'd frame our clean energy future is to look at our present. We don't get our energy from one source at all. We have a portfolio of sources for our energy, and yes, at the moment some of that is fossil fuel, burning coal, burning gas, as well as petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, and increasingly now renewables, solar, wind, batteries and pumped hydro to store that. To predict that there's a clean energy future that has one technology only, one silver bullet, you're really ignoring the realities of how we use energy and how our whole energy ecosystem actually operates. We need multiple sources of energy in our clean energy future. We need each of those multiple sources playing to their strengths. So home solar and solar on businesses is fantastic. Australia is leading the world in the uptake of home solar. We have around a third of Australian homes have solar panels on them at the moment, and every year we're connecting through new home solar. We're adding about the same capacity as one major coal-fired power station just onto the roofs of homes and buildings. Those are small energy generators, and they are perfect for supplying the small energy loads that are our homes and our suburbs and that sort of thing. But we also need larger energy solutions. We're never going to have enough solar panels to supply a steelworks or an aluminium smelter or other heavy industry. We're never going to have enough solar panels in the suburbs to supply the energy density of a city centre and how much electricity it needs to use. So we need other large energy generators to supply the large energy users. I describe it this way: there's not a silver bullet to a clean energy future, but there is silver buckshot. We need each technology playing to its strengths. The energy transformation journey, I believe, is as much a social transformation as it is a technology transformation. In fact, the reality is a lot of the technology is already there. We as a species, as human beings, even though the one constant in our lives is change, we wake up each morning physically different than we went to bed that night, and yet as a species we're very resistant to change, and in general we don't like change. So the reactions that we're seeing in the community are perfectly valid, they're perfectly reasonable, and they are at the end of the day very, very human. And that's how we need to engage with it. What does a net positive outcome here look like? What is a net positive outcome for our local environment, and what does a net positive outcome for our local communities actually look like? How can we make sure that the impact of having new infrastructure, say offshore wind in our region, is more than offset by other benefits that are going to flow to all of the people of our region and to the environment of our local region? The environmental impacts of offshore wind have been subject to a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. One of the things we've done here at the University of Wollongong through academic colleagues across all faculties is establish the Blue Energy Futures Lab. We have online, if people just Google Blue Energy Futures Lab, we have online frequently asked questions and answers. Those answer questions to people based on sound academic research, journal articles, peer-reviewed papers on what are the environmental impacts, such as they are known at this point in time, of offshore wind energy technology.
We were still unsure as to why this was so controversial. We'd heard compelling information from both sides telling us the pros and cons to the issue, but it was not yet clear enough for us to stop here. At the time of filming this, we were in the midst of an election, so this meant candidates were weighing in heavily on the issue. Our friend Alex from earlier had invited us to a community candidate meeting, where we'd be hearing from keynote speakers Ryan Morris and Suzanne DeVee. Ryan, a former ADF commander, hadn't weighed in on the issue too much in the past. Suzanne, however, had. In fact, she'd written and published a book 3 months earlier called Power Suburbs, which had highlighted why solar energy is a less harmful and more plausible form of renewable energy.
Years ago, when I heard Tim Flannery propose offshore wind farms, I actually thought it was a fair idea then, because we did need to move to renewables. However, 20 years on, we now have advanced solar technology, we have storage capability, and there's just no real reason for us to degrade ecosystems if we don't have to. I really feel that it's one of the worst things we can do for the planet, because the degradation of ecosystems is a major contributing factor to climate change. The problem when you have a linear mindset that says, let's get rid of carbon, is you're not looking at the fallout on either side. So when they started talking about wind farms again, I thought, oh, they won't do it because, Australia, we're the sunniest continent on the planet, the whole planet. We're it. And then it became a reality. And I thought, no. What the government is doing is approving new fossil fuel projects. It has approved a number of them, including 4 coal mines.
Suzanne was right. In May 2023, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek gave the approval to not 1, but 4 new coal mines across the country, more than 5 years after the Paris Agreement had been signed.
We spoke to Suzanne after the meeting and were lucky enough to interview her the next day about the issue. So first, would you like to just introduce yourself, who you are, a bit about you?
Sure, my name's Suzanne DeVive. I am standing for Lord Mayor of Wollongong. I have a strong corporate background, a diploma in town planning. I'm currently studying for a BA majoring in community planning, and I wrote a book called Power Suburbs, which is it's a strategic plan to mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss within our built environment. The wind farms will generate electricity and it will be renewable energy. However, my concern comes down to the fact that it will impact ecosystems. I feel if you can generate electricity within your built environment, why degrade ecosystems? Because the United Nations, Greenpeace, most other environmental organisations will tell you that the degradation of ecosystems is a major contributing factor to climate change. Australia is the sunniest continent on the whole planet, and we're not leveraging that. My concern is more to do with the environment. It's if I thought it was the best thing for the environment, I'd go build them. But I just don't think it's the best thing for the environment.
The wind farms are then sort of unnecessary maybe towards renewable future, or do you think that they can still be used alongside solar panels and all the
I would
others that you
say
listed?
let's do what we can within our built environment first, and I'm quite confident that if we exhaust all opportunities within the built environment, we will not need offshore wind farms. And if we do, it might be a really small one. So that would save the environment somewhat. But I absolutely don't think we would need them.
Do you think we have a time limit with climate change?
Yes.
How important is it that we act now?
Very. The IPCC said this is the decade.
Suzanne gave us greater insight into potential renewable energy alternatives. We had one last interview, Jess Whittaker. Jess is a Lord Mayor candidate who is in support of the wind farms. She's also a big advocate for the health and safety of marine life surrounding the issue of shark nets and fishing nets.
How important is it for us to act now in order to save our future?
Well,
Sorry,
I am an optimist.
Yeah.
I mean, we have been told, like, a few years ago that we had sort of 10 years to get on track and cut our emissions drastically. So if we want to make a difference, like, this is the critical decade, and yeah, we've got to get our skates on. We've got to do everything we can, and that includes like export emissions. Like, Australia is just cheating in saying that they're cutting their emissions when they're still exporting coal and gas. I think it's a huge opportunity for the Illawarra and for green jobs and for renewable energy. And yeah, I want to support it as much as we can from a council level, even though it's a federal government project. I think it's important for all levels of government to get behind something that's so important. I guess the way the consultation process was run opened it up to a lot of misinformation flowing through and people getting upset. Maybe they didn't quite predict the amount of interest that there would be in the project, and that campaigns against the project will get underway so quickly and be so well resourced. We've been running a campaign on shark nets because shark nets do cause damage to marine life. That is very well established. They kill hundreds of animals off our coast every year, and the same people who oppose renewable energy in the wind farms are not concerned about the shark nets and the animals that they're killing. For example, if there are impacts on birds, there are things that can be done to mitigate that. We need to work out how we can mitigate that. The biggest threat to marine life is climate change, and if we keep burning fossil fuels, then there's not going to be a lot left in a boiling ocean. Solar's great in the day, and there's only so much battery storage we can utilise, but the advantage of wind is that the wind blows overnight, and we need baseload power overnight. And also just the way that, the grid's already getting destabilised because there's so much solar being generated on rooftops. So we do need an alternative renewable source to counter that out, because you can't just fire up coal-fired power stations. You can't just fire up a nuclear reactor and then shut it down. The only thing that you can do to fill the gap when the sun's not shining is the gas-fired power station, and we know that that's not sustainable. I would just say be wary of misinformation, look for the sources of your information, and make sure they're trusted sources who have a good scientific background. And I would also say that there are really exciting opportunities with the community benefit scheme that may be proposed and what that could look like. And I think that's another thing that the local council can push for a really well-structured community benefit scheme that's going to deliver projects that could save people heaps of money on their energy bills. We could do electrification in the Illawarra. We could have, sporting facilities, all those sorts of things. Having a pipeline of really exciting projects is a huge opportunity, as well as the green jobs.
Alright, so as of the 15th of October, OceanX and Equinor have publicly stated that they are not going ahead with the Illawarra offshore wind project, meaning the government has denied any feasibility licenses, which has stopped any further processes or projects that were potentially going to happen in the Illawarra. A lot of people are arguing whether that's like a lack of information or too much misinformation, or it was just a whole thing, like, was there too much, was there not enough? Yeah.
And that's kind of why we made this documentary, in hopes that it could kind of bring some clarity to what was happening, hopefully provide some credible information as well that would leave you to be able to make your own decision. But unfortunately now it's not going ahead. However, the government has approved a feasibility licence in Gippsland, which means there is offshore wind farms being installed down there just off the east coast of the lake's entrance. So at the moment they're just testing some environmental factors and hopefully to mitigate any potential harm that it could cause. So whilst the denial of this project was devastating for a lot of the community, I think it's important to look at the positive side and know that this is not the end. We can now all collaborate, start bringing ideas. We know how difficult it is for the government to approve such projects, so I think it's really important that we start strategizing new ways, innovating and thinking about what we can do rather than questioning and saying what we can't.
And hopefully this is just a start for renewable energy, and that this is just a test run for what is to come in the future, and it will hopefully open people's eyes, just anyone's eyes, you guys, for what is to come in the future and what needs to be done and what kind of went wrong with this in particular as well.
And learn from the mistakes.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we act now. All ideas that we have, just bring them out on the table because they're all valuable. You don't need to be an engineer, a scientist or a researcher to be able to bring ideas to the table. I think just a start is where we need to be.
Yeah. So thank you guys very much for helping us along the process and giving us ideas, and you know, whoever helped along the way, we want to thank you a lot, because this has been like a pretty amazing journey. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we've learnt a lot, and we hope that you guys have too. So we want to say thank you, and thank you everyone for watching as well.
Maybe the wind turbines were the friends we made along the way.
See ya!